lunch and learn about setting your forest management objectives. My name is Laurel Kays. I work here out of NC State Extension Forestry, and I specialize on a variety of different prescribed fire and fire management related projects. But I also am involved with some of the women's programming that's going on here in Extension Forestry and also around the state. So really happy to be here and glad y'all could make it. So just a couple quick housekeeping items. At this point in the pandemic, I know a lot of us are super familiar with Zoom, but for those who may be less familiar, I'll just let you know this session is going to be recorded. So we are going to record this and have it available to share for those who were unable to make it today, which shouldn't be too much of an issue because everyone is muted and there is no video since this is in Zoom webinar. So you will be able to use the chat box and the question and answer feature. So the question and answer feature, and as well as the Padlet that Jen, I think, is going to put in the chat box in just a second, are 4 questions you have for our presenters. So most of today is going to be spent answering your questions about forest management objectives and how to get those done. So use either the Padlet that Jen's going to link in the chat box or the question and answer feature for that. And in both of those, you can upvote questions that you want to make sure get answered. It should just be a little thumbs up button for that. If you have other questions, if you introduce yourselves, like I know a lot of you already have, if you're having technology issues and you can't hear or anything like that, please use the chat box for those sort of things. And I just want to let you know about a couple of other women-oriented forestry programming opportunities, just in case you haven't heard of them. Those of us here in Extension Forestry try and do women's programming periodically, and we will put those on our website as they are scheduled and as they are available. The Women Owning Woodlands Network is a national network of both women professionals and women landowners who try and talk about things and work together to find solutions and just have a nice community of folks. So their website has a lot of helpful resources and also sometimes has events that may be happening here in North Carolina or in other states if you know folks who live in other states or if you happen to own property in other states. And then Forest Her North Carolina is a new group that is a project between us here in Extension Forestry and a lot of other folks, including the Wildlife Resources Commission, North Carolina Forest Service, and quite a bunch of other folks, just joining together to do more women's programming and try and reach more women landowners and bring them together as well to create a community. So they have a Facebook page and a Facebook group that you can join. They also have an Instagram page. And right now, since everything is so virtual, the previous workshop suite that had been organized for Forest Her is being done virtually. And our next workshop is this Thursday. It's going to be from 1 to 2:30 also. And that virtual workshop is going to be about managing for wildlife with native species and addressing invasive species. So if you want to join that, definitely check that out. And I think in a little bit, I can put the registration link for that in the chat box if you don't have it already. So the plan for today is pretty simple. We're going to do some quick introductions and let you get to know our panelists and a little bit more information about their background and their specialties. And then we're going to spend most of today on your questions. Again, the ones that are in that Padlet or the ones that are entered in the Q&A feature. So we'll just get right into it. I'm going to give the floor over to Dr. Zakia Leggett. She is a professor here at NC State University, and I will let her tell you a little bit more about herself and some of the really cool work that she does. So Zakia, you have the mic.
Can you all hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay, perfect. When I share my screen, I have a hard time finding where to unmute. So thank you. I am Zakia Leggett. I'm hoping everyone can see my screen. If not, just yell at me. And I will talk a little bit about my background and then kind of share why I think soils are important for us. So my research area of focus is nutrient cycling. And if you're not familiar with that, I try to give a visual. So if you think of a forest and you think of the trees in the forest, a lot of those leaves go back to the forest floor and they decompose over time. And then that forms this mineral soil component. And so that's really been my research focus for the last 10, 12 years. And so I'll talk a little bit about why that's important, and then kind of give you a few features as to things you can look for on your land. So I'll skip back. I am originally from Memphis, Tennessee, the home of barbecue, and it's ironic that I'm vegetarian being from Memphis. But I went to a small boarding school in Mississippi, and then I went to school in Alabama, and then I came to North Carolina for grad school, met my husband, and I've been here ever since. Before I came to NC State as a faculty member, I worked full-time at Weyerhaeuser Company, which is in Eastern North Carolina. My role there was a sustainability scientist, and people always ask me, like, what does that mean? But essentially, I looked at making sure the management practices that we were doing at Weyerhaeuser would not cause negative harm. So if you think on a long-term basis, when we start thinking about soil disturbance, when we start thinking of herbicide application, just really making sure that we can do our management sustainably for years to come. So this is a picture from some of my PhD work. I did contrast between sandy soils and clay soils. So I really enjoy, as they say, playing in the dirt. So this is a picture from one of the road cuts next to one of my sites. I also spent a lot of time looking at the impact of fertilization. And if you're familiar with fertilization, you have seen this contrast before. This is a site in Mississippi that did not get any fertilization, and you can see the huge difference in the plots where we actually applied fertilizer. So what about the soil? Why is it important? When we think about everything that we do, really, everything we eat, everything we wear, I do a lot of kids activities. So I'm sorry if I go elementary on you, but I always ask students, what doesn't come from the soil? And there's not much you can list. And so when we think about soil in relation to forestry, it's an asset that we really want to spend a lot of time understanding. And we really want to spend a lot of time protecting. So when we think about our land base, if you look at North Carolina in particular, there's certain areas where you have ag systems, there's certain areas where you have forestry, there's certain areas where you have pretty urban environments, and most of the time there's a reason for that. When you think of the vegetation as you're driving down the road, that exists really depending on what soil is there. So stereotypically, our most productive soils are going to be in our ag systems, and some of our lower productivity type soils will normally be in forestry. So I always talk about how plants and trees are connected. At the end of the day, what you grow on your soil directly impacts your soil and vice versa. And so I won't get into nitty-gritty detail about soil nutrients and fertilization and things of that nature, but just know that there is a really tight connection between what you see above ground and what you see below ground. So when we think about soils, I like to kind of go from a landscape level down to you actually collecting a sample. So if we think of a landscape level, say there's a landowner that owns, let's say, 100,000 acres, right? So think of that as a holistic approach. When we drop down to maybe 10 of those acres that have similar soil qualities, then most people call that a polypedon. When you think about sampling on your site and shipping your sample off to the lab, you're going to be sending off what we call a pedon. So a really small subsample that gives you a snapshot of your land base. So I put some pictures in here from where I have collected soil samples. I use this stereotypical hammer sampler. You literally could use a shovel. You could buy an auger if you want it to be fancy. But essentially, you want to get a subsample of really the surface 5 to 10 inches, depending on what you're planting. And you can actually mail that sample into NCDA and get that analysis done for free. So if people have questions about that, I can share more information. But really quickly, I wanted to talk about 5 things that you can look at when you're looking at your soil. So texture is really important. I talked about clayey versus sandy soils. That really plays a role in productivity of a soil as well as water holding capacity. So there's something called a feel method that you can do yourself with your hand and actually be able to figure out what texture you have. If you wanted to look at compaction, you could use something called a penetrometer. Those are available online, pretty inexpensive, because that's going to be really important. When you think about structure, that gives you an indication of whether your site is really dry, really wet. And so there's all types of information about soil structure. Soil color is really important. When you start thinking about soils that have been really, really waterlogged, a lot of times you see a blue-gray color. If you have a soil that's been very well aerated, you see a red color. And again, there's all types of resources that help you with soil color. And then finally, looking at soil depth. You often can have a soil that's really shallow, and that's going to play a role in what you plant and what you don't plant. So depth is really important. And I think that is all of my time.
Thank you so much, Zakia. We definitely don't talk about soils enough here in forestry, so that was super interesting, even for me. So I'm going to next turn it over to Sierra Ward, who works with Resource Management Service, LLC. And Sierra, you have the mic.
All right. Good afternoon. Can everyone hear me okay?
Yep.
I always like to check. So as Laurel said, my name is Sierra Ward, and I'm a registered forester here in North Carolina. I'm currently a district manager, a district forester for a company called Resource Management Service. And what we do is we manage timberland for a return. And that's something that I would expect many of you landowners, that's also of interest to you, is making a little bit of money off of your timberland. So some of the things I do, I like to describe my job as cradle to grave forestry. So I do everything from the clear cutting of the trees to site preparation, replanting, fertilization, herbicide treatments, everything in between. On top of that, manage hunt club and recreational leases, road and drainage maintenance. So it's really sort of a holistic approach to forest management. And I get to oversee all of that on about 80,000 acres of land that, that RMS has in my district. So I guess my area of expertise is active forest management. So as we go throughout the afternoon, if you have questions, particularly about thinning, how do you know if it's time to thin, if you need to thin, harvesting, perhaps things like fertilization, road maintenance, drainage maintenance, those kinds of topics. That's something that I can speak to, as I have a lot of experience doing that and overseeing those activities in the forest. So I look forward to, I've been reading the introductions from folks, and it looks like we've got people from all over, so that's great. So that was short and sweet, and I'll pass it on to the next person.
All right, thanks, Sierra. So our next panelist that's going to introduce themselves is Elizabeth Snyder. She works right here at NC State University. And Liz, it's all you.
Hi, welcome. You hear me all right, Laurel?
Yep, we can hear you.
Okay, so I go by Liz Snyder. I was born in the mountains of Tennessee with what was then a real midwife, a mountain midwife. We had no running water and therefore had an outhouse, and I grew up playing barefoot in the woods. So that's kind of lets you know where I came from and how I got here and why I love the outdoors and forestry. I finished my undergrad at NC State. I was a transfer and got a degree in forest management and continued on in grad school and got a master's of forestry and minor in botany. I've been forest manager for CNR, the College of Natural Resources, since about 2014, and I teach in the Department of Forestry on an as-needed basis. Before this, I worked in the public sector as we were what was called a special conservation officer, which was basically a forester with a law enforcement arm in the logging sediment control, AKA erosion control and water quality. Here for CNR, our forest management team is self-funding. So through management, we are charged with, or I'm sorry, our management is charged with paying our own salaries, covering our management costs and equipment and facilities. We employ students and provide scholarship and research funds. We do this with timber sales, facility use agreements, hunting licenses, other recreational permits, and other small income sources. My specialties are really multi-use forest management. So we're doing recreation, including hunting, horseback riding, research, and sorry, trying to blank here. And then, but also I would say silviculture, so growing forest land, and forest operations. So that's managing projects, managing contractors and student workers, while also facilitating education, research, and various events on our properties. Let me see how much time I have here. I have a few minutes. I wanted to just sort of breeze through some notes I made that might help stimulate some thought and questions regarding your goals and objectives with your property. One point I want to make is if you're intimidated with the idea of reaching out to a professional forester, don't be. Call them up, get a quick and initial consult, show them what you have, but then further ask for references, interview them, just as if you're hiring a lawyer or a financial advisor. And keep in mind, this could be a long-term business relationship. Foresters are some of the nicest people I've ever met. They help each other, they help landowners and the public. And of course, you know, there's some bad cookies out there, I'm sure, but those people don't get far because word travels quickly and forestry is a small world. We all know each other. So it would be easy to hurt your reputation very quickly as a forester. I hope I'm not speaking out of bounds here, but I'd say a professional forester is going to charge you anything, a consulting forester, anywhere from 7 to 15% of a timber sale. 15% is a little high. I think 10%, that's what I get most around here because I have used consulting foresters. But what you're going to get out of it, you can get a report of your timber volumes, you can ask for a management plan, you can get a beautiful map of your property. The forester is going to know your markets, your local markets, and timing. Regulations for protecting streams. If you have any access issues, they're going to mark boundaries and do periodic inspections of any operations. Hopefully you've asked for a performance bond from the operators and they can help, so the forester can help you determine when and if to return any deposit money. And in your management plan, if you've asked for one, they can outline next steps for reforestation, know how much of your income that you've received that you're going to want to dedicate to the next forest. So that's somewhat of what you can be getting out of hiring a consulting forester. I think I may be running out of time here, so I'm going to open up the floor, and I'm sure there will be a lot of questions later.
Thanks, Liz. And I'll also just remind everyone, we did put together just a short sort of mini course with some resources about some of the stuff we're going to talk about today. That will still be available after this webinar. And one of the resources that's on there is some information about some of the benefits of selecting a consulting forester. And some considerations, some of those that Liz touched on about that. So if you still have questions after this, you can certainly follow up with panelists, and you can also look on there, and there may be some resources that are helpful to you. But now I will turn it over to Deanna Noble, who is our next panelist. She works with the North Carolina Wildlife Resources Commission. So Deanna, it's all you.
Okay, can you hear me okay?
Yep, and we can see your screen.
All right, cool. And it's not going to slide, so here we go. Okay, so I'm Deanna Noble. I work for the Wildlife Resources Commission, and a little bit of background about myself. I'm from Kinston, North Carolina, and that's currently where I'm located. So that's in the central part of the coastal region. I went to NC State and got a Bachelor's of Science degree in Fisheries and Wildlife Science, and have pretty much been working for the Wildlife Resources Commission ever since. My first position was on the prescribed burn crew on the Sandhills Game Land. So I really enjoyed getting to spend 6 months doing pretty much nothing but prescribed burning. And then I was able to transition into a technician position under the wildlife forester, doing a lot of timber work, be it marking timber, cruising timber, pine straw sales, more prescribed burning. So that's where I got a lot of my on the ground training. And then I became the forest stewardship biologist in the coastal region, which is in turn kind of over the years has turned into just to a technical assistance biologist. So not only do I still work with the forest stewardship program administered by the Forest Service, but I also do other wildlife assistance as well. So I'm gonna go start off and just give you a little bit. Not everybody knows about the Wildlife Resources Commission, so I'm just gonna give you guys a little bit of background on what our agency is about. So the North Carolina Wildlife Resources Commission is the state government agency created by the General Assembly in 1947 to conserve and sustain the state's fish and wildlife resources through research, scientific management, wise use, and public input. The commission is the regulatory agency responsible for the enforcement of the North Carolina fishing, hunting, trapping, and boating laws. So what do we do? Well, our mission statement is to conserve North Carolina's wildlife resources and their habitats and provide programs and opportunities that allow hunters, anglers, boaters, other outdoors enthusiasts to enjoy wildlife-associated recreation. And the Wildlife Management Division monitors the health and status of wildlife populations, develops and administers programs for their management and wise use, and when necessary, helps resolve human and wildlife interactions in a manner which will assure a diverse wildlife resource for future generations of North Carolinians. So this comes to how can we help you? So the Private Lands Program, which is under the Division of Wildlife Management, our focus is to assist landowners, such as yourself. So we can come out to your property and do site visits. And during those site visits, we can address any concerns you have. We can assess the resources you have on your property and talk to you about things you can do to improve those resources that are there. And it may be, we go out and you're like, I'm not sure what I want to do. I don't know what my objectives are. So we can kind of have that conversation on the ground and walk around your property and just kind of help you, fine tune some things you want to accomplish on your land. So we provide technical guidance, be it verbal recommendations. We can write you wildlife management plans. And like I said earlier, we also can work with the NC Forest Service in writing you a forest stewardship plan. And that plan is just a multi-resource plan addressing timber, wildlife, recreation, aesthetics, soil and water, those kind of things. And we can also talk to you about the Wildlife Conservation Lands Program. And so this program can give you a tax deferment. It's kind of like the forestry PUV, if you're familiar with that. It can give you tax deferment if you are managing for a certain species or a priority habitat. We now have a wildlife helpline. So here's the number that you can call Monday through Friday for any kind of wildlife issues you have, be it, there's some kind of nuisance wildlife issue or you just want more information on something in particular. We do have biologists all across the state. There are 9 districts, and we have a biologist in each of those 9 districts. That's kind of like your point contact, and they can assist with nuisance wildlife issues, with population management, things like that. And then we also have regional biologists, which is what I am, and I cover the coastal region. I'm a technical assistance biologist for the coast. So any of these counties, I can assist you on the coastal side of things. We also have, currently we have some vacant positions, but we do have contacts for folks that can help you in the Piedmont and in the mountains as well. So here's our agency website for more information on anything wildlife related, or you can contact me directly. There's my cell phone number and my email address. So I look forward to speaking with you guys about any of your wildlife questions.
Great, thanks, Deanna. So moving right along, our next panelist we're going to hear from is Hannah Thompson Welch. She is with the North Carolina Forest Service.
Good morning, everyone. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay, thank you. So good morning, everyone. I'm Hannah Thompson Welch. I am originally from Southeast Kentucky, born and raised there, and went to Hazard Community College and got an associate's degree in forest management technology about 20 years ago. And I came to North Carolina in 2003 after working for Kentucky Division of Forestry. I've been with North Carolina Forest Service since then. And North Carolina Forest Service offers a complete line of services for forest landowners, from everything from forest management to quality control on plantings, water quality inspections if you have a harvest operation going on, and a lot of other things as well. But my specialty area is wildfire risk reduction. I'm going to share my screen with some slides here. Hopefully you can see my screen.
We can.
So I don't know if you're familiar, but North Carolina is #1 in the nation of acres in the wildland urban interface. So when you look at the land base of North Carolina and see all that green, that's a lot of the areas that we're talking about. And what does that look like in relation to homes? So more people are living in the wildland urban interface than ever before. As you can see from this image, this yard and its fence butts right up to the woods. So I work with a variety of stakeholders and landowners in the state to try to reduce risks from wildfire that could approach a property very similar to this one. And since July of 2015, nearly 20,000 wildfires have occurred in North Carolina. And likely one of these red dots on the map might be close to your location. And these are representations of polygons from acres measured from any fire that's burned in North Carolina since that time. Our 10-year average is around a little over 4,000 fires per year and around 24,000 acres per year. That's the average of what we see in 1 year's time. For my job, I work and plan for wildfire risk reduction activities for a variety of groups. I work with individuals, so homeowners or landowners, whether they live here in North Carolina or they're absentee, or any visitors that are here in our state. We do have a really big tourism situation, so we even try to get information out to the tourists that visit our state because we do have a very beautiful state. I also work with community groups such as associations like property owners associations or homeowners associations, fire departments, and various interest groups, and a lot of government entities like townships, cities, counties, and a lot of our state partners as well. And what does that mean exactly? Well, I'm trying to encourage landowners to make their home fire resistant. And that may sound really complicated, like what can I do to reduce my risk around my home? Well, it can be as simple as making sure your lawn is maintained, making sure your gutters are clean, and a variety of activities on the poster that I've got up. So a home's design, building materials, and landscape out to 100 feet. Determine its vulnerability to airborne embers, surface fires, and crown fires. You may not think that dirty gutters filled with pine needles and leaves would be a problem because you may envision a flaming front that approaches your home. A lot of times it's just the embers that fall ahead of a fire that are being thrown from the main fire into gutters, and that's what catches the roof on fire. So it's really simple activities that you can do in the home ignition zones around your home. And from the picture, you'll see that we have a zone that's from 0 to 5 feet from the foundation. You'll also see that there's a zone from 5 to 30 feet and a zone from 30 to 100 feet. You can even go out further than that to like 200 feet if you have that much land around your home. But we try to work with individual landowners to get them to understand things that can protect the most valuable resource that you invest in, which is your home, and your property. So we try to get people to think about those things as they're developing plans. And a lot of times it's as simple as working with your neighbor. And here's those same zones, the immediate zone, the intermediate zone, and the extended zone, and how 3 homes intertwine with each other's zones. So we're working with a lot of community groups trying to get neighbors to help neighbors. And a lot of times that's what it takes to make a big impact on the ground. And that's what I have for you today. And I hope if you have any questions that you'll post them on there, and my contact information is here.
Thank you, Hannah. That was great. And so last but certainly not least, before we get into your questions, we're going to hear quickly from Laura Hendrick, who is a forester who works in Eastern North Carolina. So Laura, it's all you. You got to unmute yourself first.
I thought y'all were doing that. My apologies. Can y'all
there
see
you go.
me?
We can see you and we can hear you.
Okay, great. I can only see black. So nice to be on here with everyone today. I'm Laura Hendrick. I'm a forester. I used to work for the North Carolina Forest Service with Miss Hannah. I now work for the military, and I went to Virginia Tech. I got my bachelor's and my master's of forestry there, and made my way to Eastern North Carolina about 13 some odd years ago. I would say my area of expertise has been, I wrote forest management plans for landowners for the majority of the last 13 years. I've done a lot of outreach and education, but mostly I help landowners lower their taxes by getting forest management plans in place and learning about forestry. I also am a wildland firefighter. That's my primary job now. And I also say the other area of expertise was kind of helping landowners select a consulting forester, which apparently is a big question for y'all, which we can answer those later. But essentially, I want to introduce to you the topic of forestry present use valuation and why it is important for you to have a forest management plan in place. So, forestry present use valuation is a deferred tax credit that you can apply for through your tax office if you have 20 acres of contiguous forest that you are managing. Keyword here is managing. If you own timber but don't want to manage for it, and you tell a forester that, I'm not going to lie for you. So if you intend to get the deferred tax credit, you have to manage your property. What does that mean? That may mean thinning, like Sierra talked about earlier. That may mean some type of harvest, whether it's a clear cut or, a select harvest or some type of regime like that. Essentially, they are giving you cheaper taxes for actively managing your property. There is other options, like Deanna said, you may be able to get a deferred tax for managing for certain wildlife species. So that is very lucrative if you live in an area that offers that. Also, I'm trying to think what else I wanted to cover in my brief period of time. Being a wildland firefighter, if you are someone who wants to live in the woods and manage the woods with fire, it is a great tool. And I highly recommend that you look through forest mitigation stuff that Hannah's going to bring up, because active forest management does typically include fire in our Eastern North Carolina landscape and in actually all of North Carolina. So I will say, yes, wildfires happen. We have the ability to be just as bad off as California does. And it's only through good forest management that we aren't in the situation California is in. In fact, there was an article written about 2 months ago that stated how active the Southeast has been with their forest management and prescribed fire system. So I want to say applaud to the Southeastern United States, because we've been keeping fire in our ecosystem, whereas other systems excluded it. Exclusion of fire is what builds up these high fuel loads and creates issues. So now that I'm more on the fire side of things, I kind of wanted to point that out to y'all. So active forest management, cheapen your taxes, use fire. I saw that there was a question. Laurel, do you want to do questions now or later? How do you want to do that?
We're going to do them in just a second, but first I'm going to hand this off. Do you have anything else that you wanted to add in?
I'm good, thank you.
All right, so that is all of our presenters. So we're going to just go ahead and questions, and I'm going to hand things off to my colleague Jennifer Fawcett, who also works here out of NC State Extension Forestry, and she is going to help moderate the questions for our presenters. Just a quick reminder, if you have those questions that you haven't typed in yet, you can type them into the question and answer feature. You can also type them into the Padlet that was linked in the chat box. And if you see a question that you really want to make sure gets answered, you can upvote that question and we will try and make sure that we have time for that. So Jen, turn it over to you.
Great, thanks Laurel, and thank you to all of our presenters. That was a lot of information. And actually, we're going to ask all of our presenters to go ahead and their videos back on. So this next section of our webinar today is going to be more discussions and just answering the questions that you all have. And so like Laurel mentioned, there's two ways that you can ask questions. So obviously you are muted right now, so you won't be able to speak up, but there is a Q&A function down at the bottom. If you could enter them into the Q&A rather than the chat box, that's what we are going to be monitoring, is that Q&A function. Or the link that Laurel just put into the chat box is a different link called Padlet. And so those of you who have already gone through the online course that I put into the chat box earlier, it's campus.extension.org. So at that site, we actually have a full course that some of you have gone through. About half of you have gone through that course. For those of you who haven't, that's totally fine. You're gonna have, everybody has access to this course at any given point, and you can go in and go through the course kind of at your own pace, at your own time when you want. The thought was that if you went through it before today, so for those of you who went through it before today, then you probably have already come up with a lot of questions. And so the Padlet that is open will remain open throughout the course of the rest of our discussion today. You'll notice that there's a little thumbs up. It kind of, just like in the Q&A, there's a thumbs up in the Padlet. So regardless of the Q&A or the Padlet, whichever one you choose to use, if you see a question that either resonates with you or a question that you're like, oh, I was gonna ask that same question, go ahead and click that little thumbs up button. And those are the questions that we're gonna answer first. So the more thumbs up a question has, the more we know that you all are interested in kind of hearing the responses from our panelists about those specific questions. So go ahead and read through, feel free to enter it either into the Q&A or the chat box. So since Laura just finished up and there was a question specific to Laura's presentation that I just want to hit on first. So this first question's for Laura, and it's, does a conservation easement lower your taxes even more than the PUV lowers taxes?
No. In fact, you're going to get taxed on the money you get from a conservation easement, by the way. So, one, talk to your CPA about that. Two, and your consulting forester about that. Because the way that works is you're going to receive income and you're going to receive a 1099 on a conservation easement. So it can be done together, but the conservation easement is a payment to the landowner, whereas the taxes are going to be consistent until you decide to unenroll from that program. Is that good?
Yeah, thank you. All right, so now we're gonna go to, let's start with Liz, but maybe if there's anybody else that feels like they wanna jump in on you, feel free to answer. So Liz, aside from timber, talk about some other income generating products. So for example, ginseng, ferns, etc., that still preserve the native landscape.
Okay, I'd say mushrooms are a thing. People like hunting for mushrooms, pine straw, foraging is becoming increasingly popular. I can't say I know. I've had inquiries of people wanting to forage on our properties, but nobody wants to pay for it, unfortunately. Anybody else have any ideas out there? Oh, another, I did have someone willing to pay for, they want to collect seed and propagate native plant material in order to promote natives in our area. And I love the idea. So we're working with them right now. It's a graduate and a current student working together. So, sorry, I think Laura was going to jump in.
Do you have anything to add, Laura, or anybody else?
In Wayne County, you can go to the NC Department of Agriculture Research Station where they're doing some agroforestry work. I personally think it can be done, but cattle isn't always the answer because cattle will destroy your soil structure, as Zakia could tell you more about. Essentially, if you run some livestock underneath the timber, you need to rotate it. Goats, sheep, some of that type stuff that can be done in strips. What I would recommend if you're looking to do some more native stuff but keep your timber is to manage first species like quail or something, and Deanna can help you with that because you could probably hunt it and get more of your management done that way and make money from a hunt and lease better than you can. Some of the stuff that people want to manage for like truffles and whatnot do not grow on your property. So is it the right site for that? That's a big issue.
Great, thanks. So the next one kind of ties, and it's in that same kind of line of thinking about native landscaping and having more of a conservation focus. So maybe I think I guess I'll open it up to any of you really, because I think you probably all have some experience with this. But so the question is it possible to find a forester who has a conservation focus rather than timber sales? The longleaf pine ecosystem restoration, for example. Let's start with that. There's a second question about seeking a career, but let's start with that question first. So is it possible to find a forester who has a conservation focus?
I like this question. So the forester is going to do what the landowner wants, but at times that may mean convincing them that some things are not possible. Here is what is possible. Timber is just a way to pay them, but if you're willing to pay out of pocket for advice, for restoration, they will do what the landowner wants. And some are more, may have more experience with objectives outside of timber management than others.
I will echo that. I know that there are people that manage specifically for those type things. And I think when you start talking to people and let them know exactly what you're looking for, I feel like they'll be honest and say, that's not necessarily my wheelhouse, but you can talk to such and such. So.
Great. So the second half of that question deals with career, and maybe Zakia or Liz, since you're both at the university, might be able to answer this one. So if a person's seeking a career in longleaf pine restoration and management planning, would a Master of Forestry be a wise educational investment?
I don't know that I'm going to give the right answer. I think you have to kind of decide what your long-term goal will be. If your goal is to be a consulting forester in that area, I will say you may not necessarily need a master's degree for that. If you want to work in research or have a contribute to the research community in that area, then I would suggest a master's degree. Liz, I don't know what your feedback would be.
I'm thinking along the same lines. Undergraduate degree would be sufficient. And so continuing education in graduate school, you'd be thinking, like Zakia said, in research or getting in academics. That's what I believe.
Great, thank you.
I'm a forester and I have a master's. It paid off for me. It was well worth it for me.
Yeah, and I did forget to introduce myself actually as we were going through here. And I'm also at the North Carolina State University. I work in extension forestry along with Laurel. And I found from kind of like Zakiya was saying, from a research and educational perspective, I think it probably is important, but it just depends on your interests and your goals for sure. Lots of different opportunities out there and all sorts of conservation related things. Some that agree and some that don't.
And I'm sorry, I'm have my video off because my internet's a little glitchy, but I do have a master's from state actually. And I think it can help if you particularly are like changing careers, if maybe your background isn't in natural resources or forestry, that can be a good way to kind of make that transition. But so just my 2 cents, I think it's a really personal question depending on where you're coming from and your goals. And Zakiya and Liz and Laura all had good thoughts too.
Okay, let's move over to the Padlet. There's a question here that I'm going to give to Sierra first, but if somebody else wants to jump in afterwards. The question is, I need to sell my timber during my lifetime, but I also want my land to be a place my family and I can have fun and see wildlife. Is there a way to do both?
Yeah, so absolutely. I don't think that timber management and wildlife management are mutually exclusive. Very much the opposite, as a matter of fact. If you sort of have a piece of property and just walk away and do nothing, you're probably going to exclude a lot of potential wildlife from your property, as well as just other aesthetic things that you might want to manage for. So I think that question is largely going to depend on how big of a property you have and what is your species composition. So if you've got 20 acres of a pine plantation, or you've got 300 acres of mixed pine and hardwood, the answer to that question is going to be very different as far as how you manage it and what you do. But that's just sort of knowing that and then knowing where you want to go and what you want to see. If you want to manage for, songbirds, that's something. It goes back to talking to your forester, your consultant forester, and explaining that to them what it is you wish your objective to be, and they can help you get there based on what you have and where you're at now. But yeah, I don't. They're definitely not mutually exclusive. You can definitely do both.
Yeah, that's a really great point. And I should mention too, as we go through this, maybe some of what Sierra said resonated with you, or you have your own experiences. So one thing that the Padlet does, for those of you who are using that right now, you can actually add comments into the different questions from your own experiences as well. So the panelists are going to have, we'll be giving their responses live, and then after the event, there's an opportunity for us to go back and add some written comments to any questions that we don't get to. But if any of you also have your own personal experiences and you want to share those, you all have access to go ahead and add your own comments in there as well, if anybody's interested in sharing your experiences outside of the panelists here. So feel free to do that. So the next question is going to be about taxes. So I know both Laura and Deanna and maybe a few others did mention taxes. So Laura, let's go to you first. So Laura, how do you find an accountant who's knowledgeable about timber related tax issues?
I have to go back and double check, but I felt like we compiled that list on the North Carolina Forest Service website when I was still working there. I have to double check on that because it was a pretty short list. But essentially, you need to ask your CPA, do they know about the, I think it's Schedule T for timber, and how they fill that out. I have seen that most of your consultant foresters who really know what they're doing can do it just as well as the CPA can. So your consultant should be able to help guide you to the better, because I know like in Eastern North Carolina where I'm at, there's only a handful that even know how to fill out the Schedule T. I have seen some stuff on the web now that is offered through maybe Extension, through Mark Magalos, who can walk you through it yourself without having to exactly have a CPA, but you need to know that that schedule exists so you can tell them that they need to fill it out. Is that good? Is that a one-parter?
Yeah, unless anybody else has anything different. Does anybody have any sources to share?
I don't have a specific source, but I can get one. We can follow up later with the group and email a list probably.
Yeah, we'll look for that list that you mentioned, and then if any of the other panelists have any additional resources you want to share right now. Okay. All right. Well, then we'll try to dig up that link. I think that would be helpful. I'm going to move on to Hannah. There's a question about using prescribed fire, and this person has a very specific question, so maybe we can think about it in broader measures too. So this person says, I'm using prescribed fire to maintain longleaf forests. However, we have a buried propane at the edge of one part of the forest. What safety measures are needed when performing a prescribed burn near this tank, i.e. what amount of buffer do I need? So I know lots of people probably have something similar, either a propane tank or just in general other safety things. What should people be thinking about?
So for that situation, a buried propane tank is the better option than the above ground propane tank. And with that, on the poster I showed you with the fire resistant landscape, we always want 0 to 5 feet away from that propane tank if it's above ground, to be clear, like bare mineral soil or like a non-flammable mulch like pea gravel or something like that. But if you're doing prescribed fire, I would even go a step further and say keep anything away from that for 30 feet, especially if it's surrounding your home. That would just be the safer option. But even with above ground tanks, we recommend having that. So if a surface, the 0 to 5 feet, so if the surface fire does get to reaching the side of that propane tank, that it would at least have the 5 foot buffering.
Great, thank you. All right, so this next question, probably any of you would be able to answer, but maybe we can try to start with Liz and then go from there. So talking to professional foresters is a scary prospect. Do you have any tips on how to do it?
Just call them up. They're there and they're willing to talk to you. Make a list of several. And I saw someone asked, do I want someone that's near my property? I would say yes. You want them to know the markets. You want them to not have to travel a lot and charge you for travel. You want them to know your forest types that you have in your area. But make a list, look up who works in your county, make a list of a couple to call and start those calls, and even go so far as having some questions ready. A lot of them will be willing to come out to your property for a free consultation and see what you have and then go from there. And usually, that's what they want to do. They need to see what they're answering these questions about. Is that good?
Anyone else, Sierra, or anybody else have any other tips that you want to add?
I was just going to add that ask those foresters that you're calling up for references. Maybe they can give you some landowners they've worked with in the past, and that kind of can help you make a decision on which forester is right for you.
Yeah, that's a great point. If they don't give you references, and that says something too. Anyone else have anything?
Sierra, I think it was Sierra that said they will tell you if it's not their area. If they don't know the answer, they're going to tell you. And I have heard them refer to other foresters. Like I said, they're competing, but they're also, friendly and not competing at each other's throats. So do know that. Don't be afraid to reach out and ask questions.
So I'm going to ask this next question because I think it kind of goes in line with that same topic. And the question is, how do you select a forester for forest management once you have a list of all of the certified foresters available? So before you even make that first call, you know, Liz, you said call them was your tip, but before you even call them, how do you decide who?
I'll try
So,
oh,
sorry, go ahead.
sorry, we're talking over one another. I'll try to tackle that a little bit. I would say, you know, like we said, interview them, check out if they have any social media. Most of them nowadays, even some of the older, more established folks that have been around for a while, have taken to social media to advertise for their business and to just kind of show what it is they do and how they do it, just to kind of educate landowners. So you can hop on Facebook, Instagram, you know, any social media or website, just Google and see if they have a website. You can get sort of a good idea of, you know, what the forester's like, what the business is like. If it's a big outfit, a small outfit, you know, and sort of start to wean that list down a little bit. But then, you know, like Liz was saying, just call them up and interview them, and they'll come out and meet you on your property and just start talking about ideas and everything. And most, you know, that's sort of like a consultation up front, kind of like when you're choosing a dentist or a doctor or something like that. You know, it'll always say free consultations. So they're not going to charge you to meet with them and determine if they're the right fit for you and if you're the right fit for them. So it definitely does go both ways.
I see Deanna just put a link into the chat box, a list by county on the North Carolina Forest Service website. And then one of the participants said that their local Fish and Wildlife office recommended the forester that she ended up using.
I was just going to recommend, just ask your friends to be sure you know somebody who's, you know, had dealings in forestry, whether you met them at church or at the beauty salon, or you just bumped into them at the grocery store. We used to hear a lot of people spread word of mouth through good forestry practices. Some of these foresters, if they're proud of what they did, will put a sign on the side of the road and say, this work was done by us. So call them up and be confident. Do not be scared to tell somebody what you want. I am not scared to tell somebody this is what I want, because ultimately it's my dollars at the end of the day. They're there to work for you, so tell them what you're looking for. Now there's a fine line between asking for the moon and being feasible. So just realize that if they push back, it could be because it's not something that they can do. Just kind of wanted to throw that out. Just be confident. Don't mind asking for what you want. Okay.
Along those lines, Laura, you made me think of this. Talk to your neighbors. If they have land and timber, talk to them, and that may become more attractive to a forester and a logging company. And you may get better prices if you've got more land coming in on the deal. I was talking about this the other day regarding hazard trees. So someone had some hazard trees to cut, talk to your neighbor, and maybe they have some hazard trees to cut, and then you can get a better price for that.
Great tip.
One more thing.
Something I'll jump in. Am I talking over
Sorry,
something?
Sierra.
Sorry.
Let's do Hannah. We'll go Hannah and then Sierra.
Okay, thanks. So one of the most frequent questions that we would get as a county ranger in the county ranger office taking calls from local landowners was, okay, I have this list. If I want a local consulting forester, or if I want a local timber buyer on this list, how do I tell? Well, the list all has the addresses on there. But I would say go a step further and still ask the same questions that the other ladies have given, because I realize that people want to keep local businesses supported in their communities, and there is a time for that, but there's also a time to still do your homework and make sure you're making the right choice for your land.
And so one more thing I'll add, and I clicked on the link that Deanna provided there, that the NC Forest Service link. ask about the forester's credentials. So I would be remiss if I didn't bring this up. I am a member of the North Carolina Board of Registration for Foresters. And so in the state of North Carolina, there is a licensing act to call yourself a forester in this state. You have to take and pass an examination and do 10 hours of continuing education every year. And so there is sort of a hurdle. Not just anyone can call themselves a forester legally in the state of North Carolina. And then to take it one step further, consulting foresters, those that are very serious about what they do and hold themselves to the highest standards, are members of the Association of Consulting Foresters, the ACF. So if you see a forester that has that ACF initial behind his or her name, you know that they're a member of that organization. And that's a vetted, very vetted organization. They have to, again, it's education, and it's signing on to a very strict code of ethics, where they cannot sell and buy timber both. They can do one or the other. But they can, that helps protect you, the landowner, in that they helps them from having a conflict of interest, is the long and short of it. So check their credentials. Again, a forester should be registered in the state of North Carolina and have that RF behind their name. And if they're a consultant and they're a member of the ACF, they'll have that ACF behind their name also.
Great, thank you. And what a couple resources. There's already a couple in there in the course that I mentioned. So there's a section on there on how to choose a consulting forester, and any resources that we come up with after this program today too, we'll make sure to add into that course so you all have access to that later. I want to switch gears.
I was gonna add real quick.
Okay.
So to Sierra's point about the Association of Consultant Foresters, I was trying to find the list. It was probably being worked on internally when I was with the North Carolina Forest Service, but on the Forest Service webpage, it says the ACF professionals serve private landowners as well as attorneys, accountants, financial institutions, forest industry, etc. So these accountants are probably going to foresters out with the ACF, and there's a North Carolina chapter that you should look up. They'll probably point you in the right direction.
Okay, great, thanks. Maybe somebody can put that, could you put that link into the chat box, Laura? All right, so I'm going to switch gears just a little bit here. This was a question that actually came from one of our extension folks, and it's for the participants. So rather than a question for the panel, we're going to ask participants this question, and if you can just put your answers into the chat box. There is a publication that is being developed right now. It's actually being updated. It's an old publication that's being updated on planning. So one of the objectives that some people that you might have for your forest might be diversity and beauty, kind of more of the aesthetic aspect of it. And so there's a publication on diversity and beauty and woodlands dated. So the question for our participants is, are there any specific questions or concerns around aesthetics or beauty and beauty? Any questions or concerns that you all have that might make the publication more useful? So as this is being developed, what sorts of things do you want to see included in there? So as an example, maybe thinking about pollinators, how can you incorporate pollinators into a woodland setting, something like that. So if you all have anything specific or some thoughts or questions around diversity, beauty, aesthetics, if you can go ahead and stick those into the chat box, and I'll pass those along to the person who asked that question as it's being developed. So feel free to just enter them directly into the chat box there if you have anything along those lines that you can think of. And I'm just gonna give you all a minute to go ahead and type those in while I look at our next question for our panelists here. All right. So keep chatting, keep putting those in. And I'm going to go ahead and take a question here. This one's going to be for Zakia. And this question is related to the document that was in the course. And the course had a link to a web soil survey. And the question is, so this person went through and found out their soil type at the web soil survey. And the question is, so now what? How can they use that information now that they know what their soil type is?
Yeah, a lot of people are interested in their soil type when trying to think about whether or not they need to bed. So for example, if they were doing planted pine or something of that nature, if you had a soil that was classified as what they call poorly drained or excessively poorly drained, a lot of times you'd be recommended to do some bedding on your site. Another huge factor is fertilization. So when you find out what soil type you have, you can also take a sample and mail it in. And I can put the link in the chat. But you can mail in your samples, and depending on what you're planting or what your goals are, they can let you know the levels of nutrients on your site. So it gives you some information about whether or not you need to fertilize, or whether you have, God forbid, some contaminants or something in your soil. So that soil survey just kind of gives you information about what you actually have. Depending on how you want to manage your land is where you go with that information. And if you hire a consulting forester or someone to help you with the forest management plan, you kind of have a leg up on kind of sharing with them what you know about your land. So I hope that helps.
Yeah, that's great. And there's lots of resources on that course that we have in there about how to find some of those soils as well. So for those of you who haven't had a chance to look into that, that might be kind of a next step, a good first step after this discussion today, is to find out what kind of soils you might have, which leads into this next question that I'm also going to ask Zakia you first, but then open it up to anybody else, because I think this one kind of goes hand in hand with that one. Is how do I know what trees will grow on my property and what trees are best for the things I want to do?
Ooh, that's a heavy question. I'm very familiar with loblolly, so I'm going to let somebody else take that question. But I will say that loblolly grows just about anywhere. But I think I'm going to pivot and let somebody else kind of target that question.
Okay. Yep. No problem. Because I know the soils do kind of, depending on what kind of soil you have, will also kind of indicate what types of trees might grow there. So I'll open it up to, is there somebody else? So the question again was, how do I know what trees will grow on my property and what trees are best for things I want to do?
Hey, this is Laura. So in your soils info, you can go to the soil survey and there's a woodland productivity section. You might have to search for it, but that'll tell you which species grows best on that site. So if you probably can't get your hands on a printed publication, but if you search deep enough into the web soil survey, there's a section about soils data, and then you go deeper in there and you have to ask for like specific species. And so it'll tell you which ones they recommend, but also like depending on where you're at, species wise is going to dictate, obviously. So if I'm in the coastal plain, I'm not trying to grow white pine as a primary species for investment. So just if you need someone to help you ID, there's also a couple of apps you can download, like iNaturalist, Virginia Tech Dendro, NC State Dendro. Go and walk around your property and see what is naturally occurring. What's naturally occurring is likely going to be the species you have to manage for. Although, you know, you can grow longleaf pine on some soils that you may not typically see it on. The best thing to do is contact your county ranger, ask them to come out and walk the property with you, and they'll be able to pinpoint you to the species that'll be best for that site. Just it's totally dependent on, you know, drainage and local markets and all that type of fun stuff.
I would kind of flip that question around and say, what do you want to do? If you know what you want to do, then you can determine what species are best for what you want to do, and if you can grow them. It may be, if you want to attract turkey, you may want to plant some oak trees. If you want to manage it for a return over the next 25 years, then loblolly pine is more than likely going to be your way to go. If you want to restore a longleaf ecosystem, then obviously longleaf is going to be your question or your answer. But yeah, I would sort of flip it around and say, just depending on what you want to do. And then there's a lot of great books, not necessarily trees, but this is one of my favorite, and I have no relation, or it's not a plug, but I just like this book a lot. Forest Plants of the Southeast and Their Wildlife Uses. It's just a fantastic book. It's got a lot of resources in it on where things grow, what kind of soils they like, and what kind of wildlife likes to eat them.
I wanted to add a little bit there too. So with my management, I've got different forest types scattered across mainly Piedmont and a little bit of coastal. But one forest in particular is our production forest. And so we're growing a lot of loblolly pine, and it's on about a 38-year rotation, which means saw timber at about 38 years. But it's also, that property is borderline sandhills. So when I've got an area that the soils will provide for the longleaf, I'm bringing longleaf in as much as possible to bring in some diversity. Up on our other forest, we've got a lot of pine mixed hardwoods. So also I'll step aside a little bit here. When a forester is planning a harvest, they're actually first thinking about what is going to come back. What do they want to come back in there? What does the landowner want to come back? So that determines if you're going to do a clear cut, which is going to bring in your sun-loving species, like a lot of your pines. Maybe you've got walnut in there, maybe some yellow poplar can come back in there, versus other types of harvests, which may leave some residual mature trees. So that's where we start, is what we want to come back with. So then I'll kick back over to what we were talking about, is what species you want. So when I plan a harvest up on, say, our hill forest in northern Durham County, I look at the soils and think, oh, this may be good for shortleaf pine, to again, get away from the loblolly pine. And so those may be drier, a little rockier sites than the loblolly likes. And then I'll plan for doing some shortleaf, which does require some more intensive management as that stand grows. If you're wanting hardwoods, since I talked about rotation, your hardwoods are generally an 80-year rotation to try to get to saw timber. But meanwhile, you can also do some selective cutting and go in and make some periodic income throughout. So I think I'm jumping around a little too much, but I hope that makes sense.
Yeah, no, that's okay. And for those people who aren't familiar with some of those terms, and a consulting forester or a forest management plan would have all of that in there for you. So if there's something that you're not sure about, there's somebody who could kind of help you figure some of that out. Any other comments on that one before we move on to the next question from our panelists? And I did notice in the chat box that Zakia says the soil analysis is only free until Thanksgiving. So you have about 2 months, a little less than 2 months. So if you want those free soil samples, go ahead and get them in now, it sounds like.
Yeah, if people have questions about them, they can reach out to me. Sometimes people overthink collecting the soil. It's not that deep. It's a cool play on words, but it's not that difficult to do it. So.
Okay, great. Thanks for sharing that information. All right, let's go back to the Q&A box here. And this is, there's a question from the Padlet that I'm going to kind of pull into this question. So the question is, how hard is it to change a forestry management program? And I think they might mean like a forestry plan on your property, forest management plan. How hard is it to change it? So this person says, we're purchasing 25 acres that currently has a clear cut program. but they would prefer to keep the area wooded. The parcel behind it is going to be developed with a couple hundred houses. So it sounds like they want something that's going to keep the area wooded to maybe block the view of those houses. And then there's another question in the Padlet that sounds very similar. It says, I don't like the way clear cuts look. Are there other options? So maybe, and I see a couple of you nodding your heads there. So let's start with Sierra for that one, if that's okay. And then anybody else who wants to jump in as well.
Sure. So I'll start by saying if it's a forest management plan that was just, say, written by the previous landowner or even one that you wrote, it's completely up to you to change that. So it's not here in North Carolina and in the whole Southeast. We're blessed to have the right to practice forestry. It's not a legal document. If you're talking about doing some forest management in California or Oregon or the state of Washington, you have to write about a 500-page plan. It has to be accepted by and approved by the local government, and it's very intensive in that way. Here in the Southeast, that's not the case. We have the right to practice forestry. So if you're the landowner and you want to, or if you're buying that land and you want to change the objectives and change the forest management plan, that is totally within your rights to do that. And so there's nothing saying that you have to go with whatever that plan says. Even if it was something that was accepted by the tax office, doesn't matter. You can change it. So the only thing I can think where it would be different would be perhaps if it was something that was tied up in a conservation easement, and maybe somebody else can speak to that a little bit, would know more about that than me. But I know there are cases where for a conservation easement, say you have to clear cut whatever's there and then say come back with long leaf or something like that. So that could be a tricky thing, but that would be a very particular situation.
Great, thanks. Anyone else want to tag on to that?
There are a few other harvest systems that you could consider. So you could do, if it's pine, you would consider maybe a seed tree cut or what we call a shelter wood cut. So you would leave a certain number of trees per acre to leave an overstory. But if you're expecting pine to come back to keep your pine management going, you'll want to come back in within a few years and take out those residuals once your next stand has established. Otherwise, pine does not like that shade. Unless you're talking about longleaf pine, and they do require some level of what we call shelter wood for it to regenerate. So that's a couple options. And then there's the idea of a two-age stand where you can leave the residuals and you let the forest grow underneath. And then you have to consider, are you going to keep out the hardwood competition? Do you want the hardwoods in there? So all of that can provide periodic income, but also may require some additional management that you weren't thinking of prior. I think Laura was going to.
Hey, I was just gonna add what they both said. There's other options. You can always leave a buffer. A lot of people like to leave a visual buffer to protect their property from housing development, whatever industrial operation, Walmart is behind their property. But I would like to be the timber pimp here and offer up that clear cuts are not terrible. If you like certain wildlife, they love clear cuts. If you want to benefit certain species, a clear cut may be the thing you need. So please don't hate on my clear cuts. You're killing me. I will say, depending on the age of the trees, you might be pushed into a corner. So there are some equipment limitations. So if your trees are tightly nestled together, maybe spacing is off, it wasn't managed properly. Equipment wise, you're gonna have some skidding, some trees might hit some others, so you might have to thin it down like Liz was talking about to reduce the number of trees per acre and still leave a canopy that can benefit certain birds. There's multi-resources here. that you can manage for and still leave timber, but don't hate on my clear cuts.
Thanks, Laura. So lots of different options, as you heard from our speakers there today. So I'm looking at the time. We have about 10 minutes left. I think we'll have time for maybe one more question live here. I do want to let everyone know, so any of these unanswered questions, we still have about 6 of them that probably aren't going to get answered in our Q&A box. What we can do is move those over into the Padlet so that after today, those questions will still be available. The Padlet is going to be available beyond today, so that link will be available for you all to see and to answer like I mentioned before, if you're a participant, you can actually answer the questions with your own experience as well. It doesn't just have to be the panelists adding those comments in. So we'll try to, in some way, shape, or form, have all of these questions answered. But I think we'll maybe have time for 1 or 2 more here in today's live session. So for this next question, there was one that actually just disappeared that somebody was asking about 20 acres. Are there any programs for 20 acres or less? Does somebody want to answer that question, if there's any programs out there for people who maybe have smaller tracts? Laura?
I just typed into there. I'm sorry. I was trying to answer some questions before we got off of here. So I would highly recommend, if you have less than 20 acres, and 20 acres is by no means the cutoff for many cost share programs. So 20 acres was just the cutoff for the present use evaluation program. But talk with your NRCS, the Natural Resources Conservation Service, and also the Farm Service Agency and your county soil and water. The reason I put all of those together is most of the time they're across the hall from each other, and you need what they call a farm service number or a track number to enroll in certain programs. Those people have hundreds of thousands of federal dollars available to do work on small properties. I only have 5 acres, y'all. I could get a greenhouse put on my property and plant trees for next to nothing for pollinators. So establish what you're interested in. Go into there with some things like, hey, I want to manage for shortleaf, or I want to manage for tulip poplar, and see what they have. But if you want to get real nosy, just type in those 3 offices, see what cost share options they have available, or call your local county staff. I know the Conservation Stewardship Program has 600 different projects options. I got a landowner money because they already had trees on their property. It's out there. You just, what 3 offices? The Natural Resources Conservation Service, so the NRCS, your county soil and water, that's normally through the Department of Agriculture, and the Farm Service Agency. Those 2, the NRCS and FSA, are under the USDA. And they're normally beside your county extension office.
Anyone else have anything to add to that? Okay, so I think what we'll do now is go ahead and wrap this section of today's program up then. I want to thank all of our panelists and also all of you who stuck on for this hour-and-a-half discussion and participated actively in the questions, and you all came up with some great questions, and I think our panelists did a fabulous job of answering those. So thank you very much to all of our panelists for joining today. And we did have a slide that we wanted to share with some further contact information. So I saw there was a couple folks who had asked earlier about contact information and how to reach some of our panelists after today. So if you have any questions that you think of after today, go ahead and put them into that Padlet. We are going to send out a follow-up link to all of you. So for those of you who registered and we have your email addresses, keep an eye out for an email after today. We'll include these slides. We'll include at some point a recording of today's webinar. We'll include some links to some resources. The online course, that online course is totally free and is available at any point. If you want to share it with friends or go back and, you know, you forget something, you want to go back and go through that resource. One of the things that we do recommend, if you don't have a chance to go through the entire course, at the very least, there's actually a worksheet that I believe Laurel maybe sent to you yesterday, but it's called Establishing Priorities for Your Forest Plan. And that worksheet kind of walks you through thinking about the things that are important to you and what you want to do with your property. So I definitely recommend at the very least going through that worksheet, but we'll send you some other follow-up information as well. The other thing that we're going to send out to you is an evaluation for today's program. So we ask all of you to please fill out that evaluation honestly, and please just fill it out, period. We appreciate any feedback that we can get to make our programs better in the future. So I'm going to go ahead and pass it back over to Laurel for any closing statements from her. And just wanted to thank you all again for joining today.
Yeah, thanks, Jen. And I think you covered most of it. Like Jen mentioned, we will be sending a follow-up email with that evaluation and eventually with the recording once we have that processed and available. But definitely feel free to get in touch with any of us about further questions, or if there's other folks we can refer you to that would be helpful, we'd be happy to hear from any of you. And again, like Jen said, please do fill out that evaluation. It's really helpful for us to get your perspective on our events and how to improve future ones. If there are topics you would like to see events like this about, definitely keep us posted about that as well. And hopefully we will see some of you on the Forest Her webinar on Thursday about managing for native and invasive species. So with that, I will say goodbye unless any of the presenters have last minute thoughts that they would like to share before we close. All right, if not, then thank you very much, everyone, for your time and for spending this hour and a half with us. It was great to talk to all of you, and have a great day, and hopefully we will see you on future programs.